Welcome to CS1203 Database Systems 1. This is the Unit 6 lecture part 3. Now in our Unit 6 lecture part 2, one of the things we talked about was we got into some of the details around actually creating and executing DDL statements. So that would have been the create, alter, and drop statements. What we want to do in this lecture is kind of continue that concept, but address some of the basic DML statements, which is including the insert, update, and delete statement. Now, in Unit 7, what we're going to do is we're going to do a similar thing, but we're going to focus primarily on the select statement, which is also DML. But the reason we're going to kind of dedicate a whole unit to looking at select is because select has so much capability, particularly in terms of implementation of all the relational algebra operations that we've dealt with, as well as its ability to implement things such as sorting and ordering and some of the other advanced selection features for information retrieval. So that's kind of the structure that we're going to have over the next two units. So what we're going to deal with in this particular unit is looking at the insert, update, and delete, and very similar to what we did in the part 2 lecture, we're going to look at a example statement and we're going to go execute that in our database, so you kind of see both how those things are constructed and then how you can actually execute them. So what we're going to look at first, though, is we're going to look at some examples around the insert statement. So insert statement has a very basic format, which is the insert into and the object that we're going to do, which in this case is a table, and the table is named librarian. I can then specify all the columns. Now, what you're going to find, and one of the things you're going to want to look at is the hypersql document or user's guide that we have included in the resources section of the unit this week, because it's going to have a lot of detail around how this statement can be constructed and what all the options are. And by the way, there are many of them. So, but we're going to look at just kind of a basic structure of it, and you can use the user's guide to look at what some of the different options are. But again, insert into the table name or the object, which in this case is a table, and the table's name is a librarian. We're going to specify the columns here. I do not actually have to specify the columns, so if I don't specify the columns here in the way that you're seeing, it will actually assume that I mean all columns. And then when I go in and use the values clause, then I have to make sure that every single column that's in the table is represented in the values and represented in the order that it appears within the table. So leftmost column first, all the way through the rightmost column. And what you're seeing in this example is that I have the librarian ID, the name, the phone number, and the supervisor. And in this particular case, I'm giving it a value of 1 for librarian ID, a value of Linda Lou for the name, a value of 888-555-1212 for the phone number, and I'm not providing a supervisor ID number. Now, the reason I'm not doing it in this case, and I'm giving it a null value, and you will recall that when we created this table, we said that nulls were okay. But the reason I'm doing that is that this individual, this particular library, is not a supervisor, and it is this column or this particular attribute that allows us to create that unary relationship that we talked about a few units back. We have another example here, which in this case is inserting a record value into the borrower table. And again, same basic format where I have insert into table name, all of the columns or attributes that I want to insert the data into, and then I'm specifying the values. One thing I did want to kind of highlight and point out here, which is the date. This is the default format for a date used in the Open Database or the Open Office database or the HyperSQL database. This may vary depending upon the particular database product that you're using or relational database system. So this is one of the things you have to be a little bit careful of. Dates are a little bit unique in databases because generally what this means and the way that it's actually stored within the database is that it is storing a date that is comprised of the number of seconds that have elapsed since this, time that they refer to as the epoch, which is kind of a point in time that started back in 1970. So you can go out on the internet and look it up in Wikipedia as to the exact date of the epoch, but just kind of have that as an understanding that this is the way it works. It's the number of seconds that have elapsed since the epoch, and that I have to use a very specific format for the date. In this particular case, the first value here is obviously the year, so it's 2012. The second value here is the date, which is the 7th month, which in our case is July, and the third value here is the day of the month, which in this case is the 12th. So in this particular date, what this represents is July 12th of 2012. So again, wanted to really specify the fact that you need to be conscious of the fact this might vary depending upon the database product that you're using, and that you have to be very careful with this format, because if you're not, it will not recognize it properly and give you an error, or it's going to it's not going to accept it as the date that you think it is. So you might have a date different than the one you were expecting and anticipating. So with that, we're going to kind of pop over and go try to implement an example here. So as we did with the other one, we're going to bring up our SQL dialog box and put in our first insert. So this is our insert into the librarian table. You can see we have our values, Linda, the phone number, and null, and execute it. And as you can see, the command executed successfully. If we were to go into the librarian table at this point in time, you're going to notice that we now have that record sitting in here. Again, supervisor column is null because this is not a supervisor. This is not referenced with a unary. We do not have a supervisor specified here. So let's kind of move on and look at the other insert. In this particular case, the other insert statement where we're going to insert into the borrower table. And give me one moment. I'm going to go grab that particular insert statement. You'll notice that what I do is I actually kind of go write the statements in a word processing editor, so that I can just kind of cut and paste them into this dialog box. It makes it a little bit easier to construct them. So we're going to kind of put it in there. One of the things I want you to kind of notice that when you do this, and I don't know if you can see this in the color, but you'll notice that the reserved words of the SQL language actually are showing up in blue. A lot of the attribute data, so the things that are part of the structure of the table, and the definition of that structure, things that we created with the DDL statements, show up in green, and then the data values themselves are showing up either in black when it's a number or in orange when it happens to be a string type of a value. So we're going to just kind of execute that, and then we can go back and look at the fact that we now have our John Smith record in the borrower table. So pretty simple to do. Date's correct, and one of the things you'll notice here is that we're using a different way of representing the date where we're displaying it. And this is really kind of a nice feature around dates, is that I can display this in any way that I want, but the data itself is maintained in the format that I talked about. So let's kind of go back. Gives you just kind of a good overview of how to create an insert statement. Now there's lots of variability here. So for example, instead of specifying a value as I'm doing right here by having all of the different data values that are required specified, I can also specify the value as the output of a select operation. So I might say insert into one table by selecting, joining, using projection, or any of the other relational operations from another one. So that's a neat kind of a feature you might want to look into as well. Moving along, we're going to look at the update. So update's relatively simple, and there's just a couple things I wanted to point out about this. And just looking at the basic structure, which is it's update, the name of the object, or in this case table that we're going to update, and then I have this really kind of important clause here. It's a set, and what you're saying is that this is the reserved keyword, which is set, and I'm giving it and I'm telling it what to do that action on, which is I'm saying set the value of the attribute called name, or this is the column name, is going to be set to the value of John Smith Jr. And I'm only going to do that for rows in the database that have a library card number that is equal to 1003. Now, what's important about this is that if you recall back, in this particular table, in the borrower table, the primary key of this table is library card number. And so because of the fact that this is the primary key, I can uniquely identify exactly one row, that individual that has library card number 1003, and update his information. If I were to specify something different here that was not a primary key, I could in fact wind up updating more than one row. So I might have 5 or 20 or maybe several thousand rows that all get updated with the name set to John Smith Jr. And this is one of the reasons why it was so important to have that understanding of what the primary key is, what makes it unique, so that I could get down to a set of one when I'm doing things such as updating information and or deleting information. So let's just take one real quick moment. We'll go out and get our example of a update statement, and we'll show you how we're going to execute that as well. So let's bring up our SQL command box. Here's our statement again. You're going to see the same thing: reserve words in blue, attribute names in green, text values in orange, and numeric values in black. And we're going to execute, and we see that it's executed successfully. So I can go back into borrower, and I'm gonna notice when I bring up this table that I've now changed the name of the individual. Now let's move on to our last group that we wanted to look at, which is the delete. And again, deletes are relatively simple. I'm going to be able to, and essentially all we're doing is we're specifying information to remove from the database. Now, in this particular case, it may or may not result in deleting more information than what is in the borrower table itself. If you recall, one of the things that I can do, and one of the things that we are doing, is we're specifying a constraint that ensures relational integrity. And basically the idea here is it says if I'm deleting a borrower, the one that happens to have a library card ID, library card number, I should say, of 1003, then any reference that is related to this table through the referential integrity constraint, and you remember that we did this during the lecture 2, the lecture part 2, where we defined some of those constraints. This will cascade. So when I delete this row, if I had a corresponding row in the book lended table, it would delete that one as well. So again, that's what this referential integrity does. When we had that option that says on delete cascade, that's what the action is. So when I execute this delete, I may delete more rows than are actually in the borrower table because of those referential integrity constraints. Again, we're using library card number here because it uniquely identifies a specific row. If I didn't uniquely identify a particular row or a set of one row, I could in fact wind up deleting more information from this particular table than just the one row. So again, hopefully this gives you a good idea of just kind of the basic structure of the delete statement, and we're going to kind of go in and go through an example of executing that one as well. You can see that I have my statement here, and we're going to go bring up our SQL command box again, paste it in there, and then execute it. And as you can see, I was able to successfully execute that, so I would expect to see that the borrower with the library card 1003 no longer exists in the borrower table. So we'll kind of bring that up and see that in fact we have deleted it. And hopefully this kind of gives you an overview of the basic DDL statements: insert, update, delete, how they're constructed, and how we can execute them.